Welcome to the Marketing Signals podcast, where we separate the noise from the data in modern marketing. I'm Matt Bahr, CEO of Faring, and today we're diving into the world of marketing measurement. Joining me is Andrew Covato, founder of Growth by Science. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here. Excited to get into the thick of it of measurement with you.
I know, right? I think just to kick things off, a little bit of background. Obviously, it's very extensive. I feel like most people in measurement today know you quite well. Would love to hear a little bit about your background.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. I don't know if I have that much fame, maybe infamy in some circles, but that's we could get into that in the podcast. Background, for the last couple of years, I've been running this measurement and analytics consulting company that we started called Growth by Science. We're focusing on working with advertisers, help them understand how to upgrade their measurement approach, methodology, technology, help them, as the podcast tagline goes, separate the signal from the noise. That's something that we've been doing. And really, we've leaned on experience that we've had, and not just myself, but the other folks in the team, historically from big platforms where a lot of us, myself included, built first-party measurement tools, measurement infrastructure. I've led marketing science teams and built those teams kind of from the ground up. And so I've had that experience at a number of the large ad platforms out there. Google, Meta, went in-house at Netflix to build their measurement optimization, or I should say marketing optimization and measurement engine. And then most recently at Snap, where I was one of the first measurement hires that they had and helped build the measurement org there to the powerhouse that it became. And so, a lot of us on the team, we've seen kind of how things work from the inside, from the ad platform side. And so we have this perspective of, how is measurement set up really to drive outcomes for the advertising platforms, more so oftentimes than the advertisers themselves. And so we try to flip that around and really give advertisers the tools to measure their marketing initiatives in a way that is accurate and reasonable and helps them understand how much they should be spending on their marketing initiatives.
One of the interesting things about Growth by Science and what you're doing there is you've defined the measurement stack, I think, a little bit differently than most would, in the sense that immediately marketers go to methodology or tools when they think of the marketing stack, and you've kind of taken a more wider approach of, I think it's technology, culture, people, and process is how you're defining it. Curious how you got there. What are the different levers? Culture is an interesting one. That's arguably maybe the most important when it comes to your measurement stack. So curious to hear a little bit more about where that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love this question. And, you're using that term that we love. I don't know if we coined it or not, but we've been using it out in the industry, the measurement stack versus the MarTech stack, right? I think everyone largely has a common understanding of what the MarTech stack entails, but there's almost like a subset of the MarTech stack, and then a bunch of other things, some of which you've mentioned, that are not at all part traditionally of what the industry would term MarTech, that we lump together into something called the measurement stack. And so the measurement stack, maybe we'll start with the easiest pieces, which you kind of alluded to: technology and methodology, process, that kind of stuff. It's typically what I imagine most people would think of when you allude to those things, which is, are you using an MTA, are you using MMM, are you using some kind of incrementality measurement? What internal tooling or SaaS platforms are you using to execute upon that methodology? And then what's the general procedure for taking the output of whatever it is your measurement system is and turning it into business decisions, business insights? And so that last one, I would say, is influenced a lot by some of the other parts that are less traditionally kind of enclosed in or considered to be part of a MarTech or measurement stack, which would be the culture and the people. And so what we find is when companies have a naturally inquisitive culture, a culture of experimentation, a culture of trial and error, and hey, we're going to celebrate failures of experiments as much as we celebrate successes, then we find that those are typically the companies that also have a more sophisticated measurement methodology and more interesting measurement technology to execute upon that. So a lot of what what we help our clients with, especially on the growth marketing side, is how do you take some of the characteristics of an experiment forward culture and a test forward culture and incorporate them into the way that your business runs? And then taking that a step further, do you have the right folks in the right roles to be able to execute upon that? Great example of one way that we tackle kind of culture and approach is a lot of times when we'll get into a client engagement, we'll say, hey, what's your process for looking at performance, growth performance? And oftentimes, I mean, I would say 99% of the time, there's a super heavyweight manual process looking at super granular, week to week insights that gives the illusion, I would say, of keeping one's finger on the pulse of the business. But what it actually does is spin up a bunch of work streams and kind of bogs down really smart people doing tasks that aren't really going to yield true business insights. And so working with our clients to walk back from that, reimagine those processes, and redevote those energies into thinking more creatively about what hypotheses should I be testing, how should I be testing those, and then how can I ultimately turn the test results into strategic action for the business.
I think that's like the thing most people miss is whether it's a tool is going to fix the problem or maybe even just a different methodology may fix the problem. But yeah, ingrained culturally is to me the most important thing. Even for like adoption of fairing for customers, it's like we see a pretty big bifurcation between those two different cultures. How do you think about the relationship between, like, if we think about the measurement stack, the MarTech stack, like, do you typically think of them as two totally different things? Is it more so a methodology? Is it more, how do you think about, at the end of the day, it's growth, it's acquiring new customers, it's trying to do so in the most efficient way possible. How do those things overlap? And where do companies, I'm assuming you see companies where they do not overlap at all. And I'm curious if that's an okay thing or just how you think about that in general.
Yeah, I'd say really, it's not that we just see companies where they don't overlap. It's more that measurement gets lumped into MarTech more broadly, right? It's a tool that connects to a lot of the marketing data sources and ultimately a tool that advertisers want to use to guide their marketing decisioning. And the more sophisticated ones want to create some automation and, some kind of algorithmic adaptation of their marketing deployment based on the measurement outputs. And so a lot of focus is on that. And so I think for us, when we approach client engagements, we do want to separate the measurement stack and look at it in isolation, because you can have a lot of great things going on with activation. And we have seen this before as well. Folks using cool AI powered tools, some of the latest and greatest stuff. But if you're not measuring it correctly, and if your culture and your, just everything related to measurement, what we talked about before, the tech, the culture, the people, the process, if that is not really buttoned up and conducive to critical thinking about your marketing approach, then the best tools in the world aren't going to help you on the activation side. So if I were to kind of TLDR that, in our mind, MarTech, we would separate out everything that's kind of activation oriented. So deployment, budget allocation, actual allocation of the budget, whereas measurement is everything that gives you the information to make those decisions, right? So the output of the measurement should be the input to the MarTech, and that ultimately creates the deployment. And how well that performs and how well that actions on the input, that's something that can be measured, sort of in isolation. But you can't even measure how well your MarTech stack is working if you don't have your measurement stack really buttoned up and tight. And so while we have worked with some advertisers that want to kind of go beyond just the measurement stack, and we've helped them look at tools and assess tools that go into the activation side, the core of our work really is on that measurement stack. And, it's something that we think we're kind of uniquely positioned to, to help out the advertising community with, just given the background that we have and the experiences that we've had.
Talking about that measurement stack, so you've been in-house at Netflix, you've been on the platform side, and now your exposure with Growth by Science. Like, what are I want to say the common maybe mistakes that sophisticated teams make, but maybe not even like sophisticated. Like, what are the common measurement mistakes that you see? And I guess we'll start there, and we could try to keep this. This could be a whole podcast in and of itself. So curious what those ones that float to the top that usually Yeah, obviously, I wouldn't say get you excited, but make for a clear opportunity for you to come in and help make improvements.
Well, we do get excited about opportunities, and you know, one thing that brings us a lot of satisfaction professionally is to help clients see the light. And sometimes, you know, every client has their own journey that they need to go on and their own starting point, and so it takes, you know, more or less effort and different types of effort to get folks there. But we do find that once there's numbers in front of an advertiser and they understand what they mean and they understand, you know, how to use them, there's always that aha moment, which is kind of, you know, what the team and I really love to see. But the common mistakes before we get to that aha moment, you know, I'd say the first one is an over rotation to super micro granular data points, looking at them at a far too frequent basis, not contextualizing, you know, what they mean, and even if you should be looking at them. And so I think, you know, some of the lowest hanging fruit that when we come in, you know, a lot of folks, and we talk a lot about causality and, you know, causal models, MMMs, incrementality testing. We do all of that stuff, of course, but you know, some of the easiest wins that we've had is looking at, as I mentioned, the growth processes that clients have and say, hey, you don't need to do 98% of this. You're looking at CVR of a particular channel on a particular week and comparing it to the last week's thing, and you're trying to generate insights around that. That's not 99% of the time. That's not going to be something that you can act on. And by the way, exactly that particular example that I said has a bunch of presuppositions around the ability to stitch a conversion to a channel, right, from a deterministic basis using just path to purchase data.
Yeah.
That is not a thing. As much as people want it to be a thing, it is not a thing. MTA in isolation does not work. And if you spend too much time focusing on trying to build that up, which, you know, I would say is a second common pitfall we have, is just this over rotation to path to purchase data, trying to get that buttoned up, investing in tech and in data acquisition to try to make that be a like a full blown comprehensive data set. You know, that detracts resources from where most advertisers should be spending their time and energy, which is on a culture of experimentation, designing great experiments, running those great experiments, and acting on them appropriately and decisively. So again, to kind of summarize that, because I kind of went on a meandering journey there, it's this idea of vanity metrics, looking at the wrong metrics too granularly at a far too frequent basis, and an overinvestment in what I'll call an MTA mindset. So the idea of getting data and trying to create that path to purchase data set, and then using that to solely inform your marketing output. Sidebar, maybe we'll get into this. You can incorporate some of that type of data into a broader measurement strategy, but far too often that's the first line of defense and there's nothing else. Everything else is an afterthought.
If you're thinking of kind of like more immediate output from a measurement perspective, so and not to challenge you on that in any way, but agree completely. But let's say you're launching a campaign on Meta that's more or less a direct response campaign. And you need some early signal as far as like, is this creative the right creative before letting kind of budget run for a week or 2 weeks or months, depending on what that window looks like. Is that where you'd be kind of looking in platform to try to get that signal, whether it's through CT, like click-through rates or other kind of more short-term top of funnel stuff, while almost like purposely, I wouldn't say purposely, but avoiding the MTA and getting sucked into what that looks like? Is that how you'd think of like almost like this barbell method of like, okay, we need to know that we're spending $20,000-$30,000 a day. Is this the right message? And then long term, did this work from a whether strategic perspective or channel allocation or what? Like, how would you think about the short and long term of optimization?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that we face all the time. I would say that from a short term perspective, you know, if in a pinch, you can rely on attribution oriented metrics from a relative basis, right? And so what I mean by that is tactic A is exhibiting some group of performance KPIs that appears to be superior than tactic B from an attribution perspective. Most of the time, and you'd have to verify this, but most of the time you can make a reasonable assumption that tactic A is probably better for you overall. However, you know, the absolute value, and this is where people get caught up, is they're looking at the total number of conversions, so the magnitude of those conversions, and then taking that as word of truth.
Got it.
And that's where, you know, you could be very, very off. So just because tactic A performs better than tactic B, it doesn't mean that either tactic is profitable or incremental to you, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why you need to layer on additional analytics on top of that kind of short-term assessment and optimization that help you understand if it even matters that A is better than B. Because we've come into a situation a lot of times with advertisers that are investing in platforms that they think are doing great for them, and they're doing exactly that type of optimization. And then we run an overall incrementality test on the channel and find that the channel's not doing anything for them.
Got
And
it.
so now you've wasted a bunch of time and energy and money optimizing to find the greatest non-incremental, the best performing non-incremental strategy for you, right? And what you've done in that case is you've actually optimized revenue to the platform.
Yeah.
So and not outcomes to yourself as an advertiser.
Yeah. It's spending money to spend money at that point.
Yep, it's a tax. That's something we talk about a lot. When you measure incorrectly, you're incurring a tax, a voluntary tax on yourself by paying money that you would not have to pay otherwise.
Perfect segue to, I think I have in my notes, the vanity metrics trap. Yeah, I guess let's talk about that. Like, how do you define these? Like, what vanity metrics are usually that you see? Is it like calculating everything on a CPA? Like, I'm just curious where this starts.
And I mean, traditionally, vanity metrics, as defined, historically or in common sort of industry parlances, would be stuff like likes and shares and things that aren't directly related to to something that's monetizable, or to a growth metric, right? We kind of take it one step further. We look at things like platform conversion rate, right? So again, I used this example before, but I think it's an important one. What do you need in order to assume that a platform can have a conversion rate? What is the assumptions that you need to have? It's that platform drove a particular conversion and therefore or drives some traffic that converts at a particular rate, right? If you are investing on one channel only, that's a good assumption, and you can certainly go ahead and do that. But unless you're doing that, you're usually investing across a bunch of different platforms. So how can you say that that a platform has a particular type of conversion rate when the interaction between all of the different combinations of marketing exposures, right, that a user has influences their entire journey? So it's not like there's a single deterministic figure. There's a distribution of possible outcomes, right? And that's why we always say marketing is statistics. It's not deterministic, right? There's distributions of types of conversion rates, of cohorts of people with different types of conversion rates and characteristics, and the only way, or I would say the best way to deal with that level of kind of stochasticity is to apply real statistical methodology. So a design experiment, causal impact analysis, MMM, things like that, and ideally using a lot of those in conjunction with one another. That will give you an understanding of of your marketing performance, right? It's moving away from that anything that presupposes. So to kind of summarize that particular example and generalize it a bit more, anything that presupposes a deterministic linkage between an ad exposure and a conversion, in our view, that would be a vanity metric, right? And not to say it's totally useless, right? You can still use those kind of metrics, as I kind of mentioned some examples previously. But when you make those your focus, and when you invest all your time and energy on building those, analyzing those, you can run into a lot of problems, especially if you are a more, larger spender, larger advertiser. You have a more complicated mix. That's when you can run into some real challenges and potentially be doing a huge disservice to yourself.
Yeah, and that's where we kind of transition to the point where those bottom of funnel channels are going to be the ones that are getting the majority of credit.
Exactly. I can't tell you how many times folks have been so excited about their affiliate program, and then when we run the analysis, it's not quite as exciting. That's not to say that that's always the case, and not to pick on affiliates, because we have absolutely seen cases where affiliate programs are working quite successfully and are extremely incremental. But you look at that. You shouldn't take anything for granted if you're looking at it from a purely "quote unquote" vanity perspective, vanity metric perspective, right? Complement that with some real statistical analysis.
On the topic of metrics, from a team perspective, we don't run into this too much in kind of the e-commerce direct to consumer world as much as I did in like previous consulting lives. But in larger organizations that I've consulted for or as advised, I'm often talking to like a CFO or a head of someone in the finance world who's owning measurement or at least the KPIs of measurement.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and I didn't really think much about this prior to asking this, but I'm curious where that comes in from your advising,
Yeah.
and if that's, I think there's an argument, but maybe that's like almost a good thing because there can be easily swayed or easily they understand the more statistical side of the numbers. But yeah, I guess to kick off, if you see a finance org or team owning measurement, is that a good thing for you guys when you come in, or is that usually a good thing, meaning change is inevitable, or is it something that's a little bit more difficult?
Very interesting question. I love this question. I would say, from our perspective, it's typically a great thing, but it's not that it doesn't have its challenges, right? A lot of, and it was very dependent on the org and on the type of individuals that are in leadership of that org. But I would say a good half of the time that we get inbound interest, it comes from not necessarily the marketing org, but from finance or operations org.
Got it.
And typically those individuals who are in finance and operations, they don't have a traditional marketing background all the time, and so when they look at, but they they have a very quantitative background,
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of them, and so they can already sense that something isn't laying right. Like, this attribution doesn't seem to make sense. I'm trusting what the attribution is telling me, and we're spending according to that, but I'm not seeing that manifest at the top line P&L. So something is wrong. Something along the way is not jiving, and so that's why we get pulled into those kind of conversations. And so I think there's no right way to do it or wrong way. Not to say that if you don't have your marketing analytics in a finance or operations or strategy org, it's never going to work. Absolutely not. It's really what it boils down to is again that culture of experimentation, right? And the motivation, and making sure that there's incentive alignment from the toppest highest level of leadership all the way down to operational folks, that there's an incentive alignment, right? If you have an incentive alignment, or incentives that are, hey, I just want to get more budget. If I'm getting less budget, that means I'm failing. If I experiment with something,
That's probably
I
the most
don't show
common
it.
one right there.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
Or you get other one we see a lot of is, hey, I'm the social media expert. If I cannot show that social media is not working, because that means I'm out of a job. Why would
Yeah.
I ever analyze myself out of a job?
Yeah.
So like, those are kind of fundamental things as a part of the culture and people component of the measurement stack that we address, so that we don't run into those kind of unnecessary roadblocks when you're looking at it, right? I think a great win for a marketing org should be, guess what? I can slash my budgets by X% and still get the same amount of of conversions. That's not a loss. That's a huge win. It's arguably a loss that you didn't discover it sooner, right?
Sooner, yeah.
But it's better to have discovered it at any point in time than to continue spending aimlessly,
Yeah.
and artificially inflating your efficiency metrics. So
On the topic of attribution, and we talk to customers all the time who, to your point, are trying to recreate that path to purchase, whether they're using Segment or orchestrating something themselves or using a tool for the whole thing. What, like, to just ask the dumb question, but like, why is that a bad idea? Like, what are and I can list 10 reasons here, but I'm curious to hear what you
Sure.
think.
I think the biggest reason, something that you said before, right, which is channels that are really good at identifying somebody's a priori probability of converting and showing ads to that person, is those are the channels that are going to always win in a post-exposure world. So, and by the way, we'll talk about the data quality, but let's assume perfect visibility into the data. So let's assume that the plethora of problems that exist with data acquisition for post-exposure attribution don't exist. And so in a perfect data world, if you even in that type of scenario, the methodology is wrong, because it will always promote channels that are great at putting themselves in front of somebody that's going to buy anyway, right? This is how all of the platforms optimize right now. And some of them are talking about incrementality optimization and whatnot. Great. Maybe that works. Maybe that will not work. At the end of the day, if you look at the fundamental architecture of their ad tech stacks, it is all based on a bunch of behavior that a user exhibits that allows the platform to predict their propensity to convert for a certain advertiser, and showing them ads that will help them convert for that, right? And by the way, this is not like, I'm not saying that this is like always wrong and that everybody who sees an ad would have already bought that product. right? But it's also not necessarily helping advertisers accomplish their goals. It's an optimization, and this is something I say all the time, right? Platform optimization isn't optimization for advertiser outcomes. It's an optimization for ad platform revenue, right?
Yeah.
So whenever I say that to folks, there's always like a, hey, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, so you need to, as an advertiser, you need to take responsibility for, let me understand if what I'm doing is truly in my best interest. And of course, there's ways that you can make stuff work. I mean, you would not have the volume of ad spend that's out there if it didn't at least somewhat work. Of course, it does work, but you need to, as an advertiser, take ownership
Yeah.
of that process.
It's interesting. I had a conversation over the weekend with someone talking about geolift studies versus conversion lift, like in-platform conversion lift. And the data that they were seeing was conversion lift was just like geolift is the way to go 100% of the time because the platform's kind of owning that. And it's similar
Yep.
to what you were just saying, is where the platform has
Yeah.
different incentives, arguably, than the advertiser.
Well, let's dive into what's going on, right? With ATT, so Apple's App Tracking Transparency Protocol, for those not, I'm sure most of your listeners probably already know that.
Yeah.
But in any case, that what it effectively did was break most of the platform's ability to deterministically tie a conversion event to an exposure. There's a lot of reasons why. We don't have to get into all that, but all you need to know is before, when you used to be able to match, say, 50, 60% of those conversions, that was cut by a significant margin. Okay. And maybe it wasn't that figure is arbitrary, by the way, more or less for different channels. But in any case, the visibility into the conversion event and ability to tie that to an ad exposure was hampered. So what was the ad platform's response? Well, let me use the data that I have about users, the truth set of people that I do still see that deterministic connection for, and let me predict if an exposure that I cannot link to a conversion, let me predict if that had a connection to an exposure. So it's kind of inventing conversions,
Yeah.
right? And not to say that never works, but I mean, when you have that as a baseline data set that is going into not just your attribution, right? So your 7-in-1 attribution that the platforms report on, but you also are using that data set in the conversion lift. Doesn't surprise me that you're seeing a lot of really fantastic lift numbers from platforms. And again, they're not doing this intentionally to inflate things, but when you've got modeling on top of modeling on top of modeling on top of modeling, there's just more direct ways to measure it.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not suggesting that advertisers never rely on platform level conversion lift. I think they can be a good tool and in some cases a necessary tool. But if possible, I would say try to take ownership over the measurement yourself. And you can do this. There's a lot of open source out there. There's a lot of great SaaS platforms, and we work with a lot of them, partner with a lot of them. We deploy custom open source code for our advertisers. We build a lot of this stuff in house, and the benefit of some of the work that we do is we are not locked into any particular lift testing methodology. We use anything that's available, and again, nothing. Advertisers are certainly able to do this on their own, but there can be a lot of pitfalls to running your experimentation, especially if you don't have the cycles in doing
Yeah.
it. So there are things to be aware of on all sides, and I think that latter point is a big reason why advertisers kind of lean on the platforms and say, oh, you know what, I don't really have a PhD in stats on staff that can help understand how to run a synthetic control or difference in differences analysis. Like, yeah, I don't have that. So let me just use the platform. It's a couple of buttons in the UI and off to the races.
Easy enough. Yeah.
It's a good starting point. Shouldn't be an end point.
You've mentioned post-exposure attribution a few times. Can you actually just define that?
Absolutely. So post-exposure, right? Post-exposure meaning after exposure. So it's a kind of our terminology for MTA mindset, path to purchase based conversion. So what I would lump, and I use post-exposure attribution to categorize any type of attribution methodology that relies on some kind of algorithmic or rules-based assignment of credit to channels that preceded a conversion event. And so inevitably, to do that, you will need to have a sort of a path to purchase data set to be able to conduct that. And so examples of some things that are post-exposure. MTA, any type of MTA is post-exposure. Last touch, first touch, U-shape. I don't know if people are still using those things. Hopefully not. But any kind of rules-based attribution. I would argue that DDA is also is also a post-exposure attribution.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting topic, but I'll throw it out there. And if I'm wrong about this, I'd love somebody to correct me on it. But from my research and from our assessment, DDA looks like it compares paths, different paths, and creates sort of like these quasi experiments to find the quote unquote incrementality.
Yeah. Can you define DDA for everyone?
DDA, data driven attribution. This is in GA. This is I think their default now. I'm not sure. Maybe they've changed that, but they do have DDA in there as an option. And some of our advertisers will say, "Oh, we're using DDA. Is that not like scientific?" And in my mind, the answer is no. It's probably a little bit better than last click, but there's a whole slew of problems that are brought about when you try to compare different paths of conversion. One that has a particular advertising channel, and one that doesn't. There's a bunch of other problems with that. Long story short, if you want to do something that isn't path to purchase, post-exposure attribution, you need to be thinking about experimentation as the core. The fundamental first step is experimentation. A close step after that is an MMM that you will couple with incrementality testing. If you use just incrementality testing, you're going to miss a lot of visibility. If you use just MMM, you're going to miss a lot of the correctness that incrementality testing can bring.
So when building that experimentation framework, like I think how should a brand go, or a marketer, or whoever's kind of owning this within the org, how should they go about doing that? To me, and just to hypothesize here, but a lot of it is the introduction of it is most likely an introduction of a tool more so than a methodology. It's like I could just picture somebody, let's just call it myself, even just saying, "Hey, we need an incrementality tool." It is in the zeitgeist right now when it comes to measurement. What is the proper way to think about utilizing these tools, methodologies, et cetera? Like where should a marketer actually start?
Really great question. I think the marketer needs to start with a hypothesis, and they need to be able to have just the general framework in place from a people and culture perspective to perform experiments. The tool is a second order problem, right? What tool am I going to use?
Yeah.
Right. If you don't have the culture of experimentation in place, or the desire to start a culture of experimentation, then you can have the best tool in the world, and you're going to be angry that you're not getting statistically significant results and questioning things, and meanwhile not thinking about, well, maybe I don't get statistically significant results because the thing isn't working.
Yeah.
Right.
What's to take a step back? You said form a hypothesis. What is an example hypothesis? Like, what are just to like spin the wheels here? What are some examples that marketers should be thinking about?
I'll give you a couple of examples of good hypotheses and less powerful hypotheses, right? A good hypothesis would be the mix that I have right now. I am oversaturated or I am undersaturated on this mix, and therefore I think I should be spending more, or I think I should be spending less at this current mix. So I think that's a great hypothesis. It gives you a clear, very macro level question that you can answer, right? Which is, let me compare this mix at a certain budget level, and then let me compare it to that same mix at a higher budget level. And you can test that out pretty easily in most cases for a good chunk of channels. There's some channels where you can't really do that, but for the channels that you can test something like that out, it's a pretty clear test.
Yep.
I think a bad hypothesis would be something that's so granular, assuming that you haven't solved things that are more macro level. Like I think that I need to go from a 1% to a 5% lookalike model on channel XYZ.
Got it.
Right. Like, is that really the thing that is going to make or break your marketing? And we see this all the time. We see a collection of these super tiny micro tweaks, right? Oh, should I use a blue font or an orange font for this creative? What if I put the call to action over here versus there? The percent lookalike, what bid level should I set? You know what I mean? Like all of those things, they're not bad questions, but they're bad questions if you haven't answered something as fundamental as, is my overall marketing mix incremental to me?
Yeah.
Right. And 99% of the time, I would say almost every single time, I can't think of one instance where we walked in and asked that question and been met with, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
We have not, most advertisers don't know if their current mix is incremental,
Yeah.
or more dangerous, they are measuring it in a incorrect way and think they have an answer to that, but actually don't. And
It's like addicted to a ROAS almost. Like it's
yeah,
addicted to, yeah.
yeah, we recommend every single time we recommend advertisers do like shut off as much of your media as you possibly can in a certain place. It's scary to think about that, but
That's the hardest. Yeah. That's the hardest part about running any of these experiments.
absolutely right. There's an opportunity cost, but what we call that is a measurement tax, right? You always have to pay a measurement tax, and you get to decide how you want to pay the tax. Do you want to pay it by potentially overspending or underspending because you don't know the true value of your marketing? Do you want it because that's like it's hidden? There is a measurement tax that you're paying, but it's hidden. It's either an opportunity cost because you're not scaling up as much as you could be, or it's that you're overpaying by X percent because that percentage of your marketing does not work. So that's the hidden measurement tax that exists with most marketers today. There's an explicit measurement tax, which would be the opportunity cost of shutting off a channel to understand if it's actually working. My mind, I always like to see what I'm paying. I don't like a question mark in the service charge on a, you know what I mean? Like I want to understand what I'm actually paying. So I would always lean towards, let me take ownership over the measurement tax and decide how much I'm willing to pay. And by the way, most of the time when we shut a channel off, we find that, wow, it can reasonably be shut off or at least reduced in spend. We see that a lot. And at first it's scary for advertisers, and then they get excited, like, wow, we can redeploy this, right? We can do something better with that money. We can still make the same growth. That's awesome.
Yeah. When you're running these, if we think about the entire media mix, and obviously MMM is built for this, but more so on the incrementality side, how are you thinking about the kind of value add of different channels? Where running an incrementality test, let's say on TV, but they're still spending on Meta, like, how do you get around that? Or is it more so of like, hey, if we're going to be doing some kind of geo holdout or something, we need to make sure that like exposure is as minimal as humanly possible?
Yeah, it really depends on the situation. It depends on what you're trying to test, right? Like theoretically, you could create a super complex full factorial experiment where you've got every combination, you know what I mean? You could theoretically do that. Practically, you would never do something like that. And typically, I mean, we try to keep our incrementality testing as chunky and coarse grained as possible. Like, let's turn off not just one channel, but let's turn off this group of channels, like all of paid social. Let's see if your paid social group works, right? Let's see if your app network portfolio is incremental, right? Stuff that is very similar, that operates kind of in a reasonably comparable way, and that you can target geographically. So that's where we start, and typically that also correlates to where people are spending the most. Although now that's changing with a lot of investment in podcasts and influencers and things like that, and so that becomes a little bit more complex. But to answer the interaction question, we typically rely, at least in the early stages, we typically rely on MMM to help distill that.
I'm going to move to some of the kind of the AI, obviously, question in a second, but for another method, like obviously MMM, incrementality tests, spike tests, is that something that you recommend? And for listeners, essentially, it's, let's say you're not spending on a specific channel, and then you spend extremely aggressively in a specific DMA or geo or whatnot to try to understand that lift. Is that something that you recommend? I feel like I often see it when a brand is not excited about paying that measurement tax, and it's almost the inverse of like, let's actually spend more to try to see if this works. Curious. Yeah, just curious your thoughts on that methodology and if there's a place for it.
Yeah, there's definitely a place for it. I mean, for some channels, that's the only way that you can test. So podcast is a great example of that, right? You can set up a bunch of deals and deploy them when you had none previously, and then all of a sudden you've gone from zero to a bunch. And there are statistical approaches that we use them regularly to look to understand, is there a causal relationship between that increase in spend and what ultimately resulted in in your terms of your sales outcome or your performance outcome. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I would argue that if you're doing that on a programmatic channel, like say social, some kind of paid social or whatever, something like that, that you're basically just doing a geo test at that point. If you're lighting it up in a couple of geos, you can just pick, if you do a little bit of forethought, pick the geos that you want to do that in. Make sure that you have a synthetic control designed and constructed for that group of geos, and just go ahead and run that as a geo test. It's just the inverse of like I'm going to go dark test. But the math and the stats are virtually identical. You're just looking for a positive lift instead of a negative lift. So I mean that's totally reasonable. But the places where we see that apply more than anything is as I said, the hard to test channels, the hard to geographically target channels or randomize channels. And yes, it's a totally reasonable thing to do. And when used correctly, like any tool, right? It can be powerful.
Moving into just AI or some of the causal AI, essentially, um, I guess to take a step back, where do you see the measurement stack going with the onset of AI? And what, like, we're most likely talking about like reinforcement learning more than anything, but curious your thoughts there. I feel like we're in a pretty the market has been like flooded with incrementality tests and vendors, and MMM is obviously has been around for forever, but definitely a resurgence. There's a ton of AI when it comes to what you alluded to before of like using probability on through these platforms to predict when conversions are happening. Or do you see, like, I'm curious where you see if any of this carrying over to for the advertiser?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that AI is only going to be as good as the data that you feed it. And if you build an AI and you're feeding it post-exposure data, it's going to be great at giving you post-exposure answers, which are going to be wrong. So before we start thinking about some kind of fancy LLM type thing where I'm going to type in something and it's going to give me great causal inputs, you have to think about getting fundamental data to support that. And the reality of it is it's still super hard to deploy a marketing test, right? The reason why advertisers come to us is because it's hard. And the reason why there's been the number of SaaS platforms that we've seen crop up over the last couple of years is because they're all trying to solve that problem. And while a lot of them are making great strides and doing really innovative things, the reason that we at Growth by Science did not go into, and I tell this we're very close with all the SaaS companies, and I tell this to all of their leadership. The reason we didn't go into that is our hypothesis as a business is that measurement is still so bespoke and needs to be so bespoke to every advertiser that building an all-encompassing SaaS is it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough to do that. And I would say the same goes for an AI to do that. It's not to say it will never happen. It's not to say that it's out of reach. Certainly it is. But, a lot of our advertisers right now, they need answers tomorrow.
Yeah.
Actually, they needed them a week ago.
Yesterday.
And the only way to do that is to get your hands dirty and understand all the nuances and hiccups of an advertiser's data stack and MarTech stack and their measurement stack and build them something that's very bespoke. And so a lot of the work that we do is on that. And oftentimes, or not oftentimes, but a good portion of the time, we'll say, you know what, there's a good reason for you to use XYZ tool. And so we'll recommend the right tool for them to use, the right SaaS tool for them to use. But again, measurement, in our view, at least for the next while, is still going to need a lot of hands-on folks that have seen where things go awry, where experiments break, that can pivot. And we've done this, I would say 100% of the time we've run an experiment, something has happened. Most recent, when this is
100% of the time.
100% of the time.
Yeah.
I've never seen an experiment that has gone off totally flawlessly, right? And you have to be able to first of all anticipate where things can go wrong, so mitigate that to start. But there's things you can't control, like tariffs going live in the middle of an experiment when your product is correlated to the financial markets. Okay, Well, what's that going to do for your experiment? You know what I mean? Like it's you have to you're going to have to navigate stuff like that. There's always going to be something, and that's where I think we've chosen to take the approach that we have, being a service first company, and relying on a lot of the great tools that exist out there that are open source, and we've of course got some proprietary stuff that we've built to facilitate that as well. But being a service first measurement company sort of mitigates that.
In wrapping this up to like two final questions. The first one, I'd be remiss if we didn't mention, how did you hear about us? Kind of self-reported data in this stack. We're still, we work with thousands of brands at Fairing, but I'd argue we're still very early in our stage of our big focus now is like, how do we inject science into kind of the data that we're capturing? Our mission is very much how do we read people's minds, if really where we want to go. It's like, what was the channel or what was the reason? Curious where you've seen that valuable. I know we've had a couple conversations on here, but whether it's a brand you've seen or even just like how to integrate it. So we have brands today using it as a prior and an MMM. Like there's definitely an input here, and arguably we do a pretty good job on the top, like higher up on the funnel. It's almost the inverse of last click data, but yeah, curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, Matt, I think I reached out to you, Matt, a while ago because I was so interested in the work that you were doing, and Fairing kept coming up in some of our work, and we do recommend Fairing to our advertisers when appropriate, absolutely. And I think in general, how did you hear about us is an extremely powerful data point. To be honest, if I had to pick between Heidi How and the last click, I would pick Heidi How all day. And both have their limitations, right, and their strengths. And I would not suggest that somebody rely exclusively on Heidi How. But I have seen instances where you can calibrate a causal model, or rather, I should say, a causal model can calibrate the output that a Heidi How survey generates, and you can use that pretty appropriately and to high degree of accuracy to be able to make your more day-to-day adjustments. I think the prior to an MMM is an awesome use case. I love that. Something that we recommend folks do as well. The name of the game is to get the right kind of data and consolidate it in the right way. And I think the interesting piece about Heidi How is it totally cuts across any of the biases that has different biases, of course, but it cuts across any of the biases that exist from data collection from a post-exposure perspective. And it can be an awesome complement to, to other more causal scientific approaches. And then as you continue to develop your product, now you've shared some of what you have in mind. I think all of that's really exciting, and I'm very curious to see how you guys continue to adapt the model and the offering. But yeah, long story short, definitely a big fan of Heidi How and it can be a pretty integral component to a measurement stack.
Yeah, no, obviously couldn't agree more. To wrap things up, what is like let's say you are a marketer, you're at a mid-sized brand, like call it doing over 50 million in revenue, and you're starting to push your organization into kind of a more modern day measurement methodology. What would you say, like, what's the first thing that you should do?
Turn off your media. Whatever media you can turn off, turn it off. That's what you should
Simple as that.
do.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Turn it off. Ideally, if you can turn it off in certain geos, you can put some stats behind it and do a test, but do that. And I mean, I say that for shock value. It's literally what we would do, but really the question you're trying to answer is, what is the overall incrementality of my mix and at my current budget level? And so you need to answer that question, because the answer could be it's wildly profitable and it's wildly successful, in which case double down, keep the mix the same, spend more. There's a number of things that you can do to kind of put fuel on the fire. Yeah. Or the answer could be, we're in deep trouble. It's not, we're spending money, and we have been spending money like drunken sailors, and it's not, it's not doing anything for us. Yeah. The answer to that question will give you real power to say, let me either cut my budgets or let me increase them. And that's the most fundamental question that I don't think anybody asks. So CFOs, any CFOs that are out there, I want you to go to your CMO and ask them, what is the incrementality of your overall marketing. Ask them that question. And if they don't have a good answer for you, I think it's time to start figuring out, should we be shutting media channels off? Should we be running a test? It's a good discussion starter for how do we figure that out. And of course, you got to be remiss to say, Growth by Science, we're here. We can help you answer those questions, of course, but there's a lot of ways that you can answer them. But ask yourself that question. And if you're a CMO and you don't have the answer to that question, be prepared, because especially in the turbulence that's coming up ahead, with the economic changes that are happening, that's going to be top of mind for finance leadership.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You kind of alluded to it before, but if people want to follow up and find you, where can they do so?
Yeah, active on LinkedIn. You can follow me directly, just Andrew Covato, Covato. Growth by Science as well. You can follow us there. Always happy to answer questions, folks. We offer a free sort of consultation for anybody that wants some general overall advice on how to approach measurement. Always open to doing that and connecting with smart folks, and a welcome also contrarian opinions. If anybody thinks that I said anything wrong or disagrees with it, would love to hear why, and engage in a healthy, constructive debate on it.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thanks, Matt. Awesome to be here. Appreciate it.